In the state of Oregon, there are two different handbooks that you can choose for elementary education teacher licensing. And one of them is the Early Childhood Handbook. So I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of information about this handbook, and hopefully it will help you to decide whether this is the one that's most appropriate for you. The Early Childhood Handbook is probably most appropriate for kindergarten and first grade. And that's the time when the students are, 6 years old, 7 years old. And the thing about the Early Childhood Handbook is that it is really focusing a lot on developmentally appropriate practice for this young age group. With that in mind, the creators of this handbook used National Association for the Education of Young Children standards to help write the expected activities and outcomes for this age group. It requires a learning segment of 3 to 5 lessons. And what's important here to remember is that your students need to be involved, actively engaged in multimodal learning activities. So they're up and around, they're doing kinesthetic work, they're doing visual work, they're doing auditory work. They're effectively working with technology to expand their understanding of the content. The other thing that's part of this is the interdisciplinary connection. You're going to be designing within your lessons opportunities for students to capture and grow their language skills around the topic, but also connecting with other curricular areas. So it's interdisciplinary, perhaps thinking of that as being thematic. The lesson design and instruction really should focus on the whole child. We know that there are developmental levels, there are cultural expectations, and there are linguistic strengths and needs of all of our students, and it's all different. So knowing your students and knowing their needs is incredibly important. Task 1 is where you start the planning process for this learning segment. You will have a central focus. Now, this needs to be significant enough that you can actually design 3 to 5 lessons around it. And again, thinking in terms of that foundation, your students' literary skills and how you develop language with them and help them, support them with that is the key. The process through which you do that is multimodal. So you're planning at this point, what are those varied learning experiences where I get my students up and active and moving about? What are the interdisciplinary connections that you're planning to weave in so that they're getting a little math or a little science or a little social studies all around that same topic or central focus, and all rich with the language and vocabulary. Vocabulary development has to be intentional on your part. You have to think about the opportunities during which you will be calling on your students and encouraging them to demonstrate their growth in vocabulary and using that vocabulary. So as a teacher, you have to be preparing, right? You have to think about what those lessons look like. So you'll develop out your lesson plans and thinking about how you will address the needs of each of your students. Sometimes that means groups. You'll not want to teach everything whole class. And in fact, in the Early Childhood Handbook, you do have a requirement for some small group or individual teaching and video evidence of that. So determine up front, where are the appropriate groupings? Intentionally plan for the time when it's best to teach this whole class. It's best to then break into small groups for this. Here's where I'm going to work with my individual students. Formative assessment is something that goes on all the time. We know that. It should be part of every lesson. So think in terms of the variety of assessments that you're going to bring in and how you plan to document the results of those assessments. You're going to need anecdotal notes. You're going to need video, and you're going to need student work. So plan for where that makes most sense. There is a summative assessment component, one common assessment all of your students will do. And this should reflect the learning goals for your learning segment. And as part of any kind of summative assessment, you should have an evaluation criteria. And also you need to plan for how you're going to document the work of the student as well as your feedback to the student. So again, video is going to be a part of this. In task 2, you actually do the teaching, and you will select 2 focus students. One of the 2 must have specific learning needs. So thinking about your class and which students would fit into that category. You're going to be collecting a variety of artifacts for these students, and these can be collected throughout the learning segment. And in fact, you should plan for collecting throughout the teaching. Planning for the video. You know, it's one thing to say, okay, I need 2 15-minute video clips, but honestly, you don't necessarily know when the magic is going to happen. So I encourage you to capture all the video, you know, and make sure that you're capturing students working in those interdisciplinary activities, students involved in multimodal learning experiences, and where the language is happening. Where are you having those rich discussions and the students are responding and adding to each other's thoughts? So the video, eventually you'll carve it down and you'll have one clip that is either whole class or small group, and you'll have one clip that is either small group or individual student. Continuing with your task 2, even though your assessment evaluation takes place in task 3, a lot of the collection happens during the instruction. So you want to be aware of that, and you're collecting evidence along the way. So you're analyzing the whole class in terms of how are they doing, right? Those formative assessments, and how am I doing with the learning as we go? Thinking about how am I deepening student understanding through my instruction, through my discussion? Am I eliciting student responses? How is that working? And then what is the evidence of student use? Now, student use of vocabulary doesn't have to be just your focus students. It can actually be any of the students in your class. So again, video is best. If you video everything, you will have an opportunity to capture lots of gems where students are speaking and using the vocabulary. There is specific evidence to your focus students, so you will need to collect video evidence of learning for both of your focus students. You will need to collect evidence of your feedback to your focus students. And again, at this age group, video seems to be the best way to do that. And then you'll submit your anecdotal notes on your focus students, which you'll collect throughout the learning segment. So then we get to task 3. Task 3 is the assessment piece. This is where you really take that summative common assessment, making sure it's developmentally appropriate and significant enough to actually give you enough information to see student growth. It must demonstrate students' growth in literacy and language development. That is a requirement. You will have an evaluation criteria. That can be a rubric, scoring guidelines, checklist. And when you do the analysis of the whole class, you're going to be looking at both qualitative and quantitative evidence. So kind of be thinking about how you are collecting and documenting all of that. Finally, in task 3, you dig deep into the evidence you've collected on your focus students. Commentaries or the written responses to the prompts are expected for each task. There is a template, and you will use that template. The prompts are sophisticated. It's analytic writing. It should be thoughtful writing. So take your time on it. Plan to have the time set aside for the writing. There are artifacts that you will be uploading as well for the reviewer. Those include your lesson plans, instructional materials, student work, and all the videos we've already talked about. And the context for learning is a document. It's a template that you'll use, and it provides the reviewer with the foundational knowledge for what they are going to be observing when they review your portfolio submission. So it's important to be comfortable with the entire handbook and the expectations. And so I always like to encourage you to read your handbook thoroughly and plan for those, if you will, 10 to 12 weeks to prepare for start to finish with this particular portfolio process.